A Wrinkle in Time, Day 7. Just as she caught up with them, Charles Wallace stopped and raised his hand, and there was the elevator again, its yellow light sinister. Meg felt her stomach jerk as the swift descent began. They were silent until the motion stopped, silent as they followed Charles Wallace through long corridors and out into the street. The Central Intelligence Building loomed up, stark and angular, behind them. Do something, Meg implored her father silently. Do something. Help. Save us. They turned a corner, and at the end of the street was a strange dome-like building. Its walls glowed with a flicker of violet flame. Its silvery roof pulsed with ominous light. The light was neither warm nor cold, but it seemed to reach out and touch them. This, Meg was sure, must be where it was waiting for them. They moved down the street, more slowly now, and as they came closer to the domed building, the violet flickering seemed to reach out, to envelop them, to suck them in. They were inside. Meg could feel a rhythmical pulsing. It was a pulsing not only about her, but in her as well, as though the rhythm of her heart and lungs was no longer her own, but was being worked by some outside force. The closest she had come to the feeling before was when she had been practicing artificial respiration with Girl Scouts, and the leader, an immensely powerful woman, had been working on Meg, intoning out goes the bad air, in comes the good, while her heavy hands pressed, released. Meg gasped, trying to breathe at her own normal rate, but the inexorable beat within and without continued. For a moment she could neither move nor look around to see what was happening to the others. She simply had to stand there, trying to balance herself into the artificial rhythm of her heart and lungs. Her eyes seemed to swim in a sea of red. Then things began to clear, and she could breathe without gasping like a beached fish, and she could look about the great circular, domed building. It was completely empty except for the pulse, which seemed a tangible thing, and a round dais exactly in the center. On the dais lay what? Meg could not tell, and yet she knew that it was from this that the rhythm came. She stepped forward tentatively. She felt that she was beyond fear now. Charles Wallace was no longer Charles Wallace. Her father had been found, but he had not made everything all right. Instead, everything was worse than ever, and he adored her father. And her adored father was bearded and thin and white and not omnipotent after all. No matter what happened next, things could be no more terrible or frightening than they already were. Or could they? Or couldn't they? As she continued to step slowly forward, at last she realized that the thing on the dais was what it was. It was a brain. A disembodied brain. An oversized brain, just large enough than normal to be completely revolting and terrifying. A living brain. A brain that pulsed and quivered, that seized and commanded. No wonder the brain was called It. It was the most horrible, the most repellent thing she had ever seen, far more nauseating than anything she had ever imagined with her conscious mind, or that had ever tormented her in her most terrible nightmares. But as she had felt she was beyond fear, so now she was beyond screaming. She looked at Charles Wallace, and he stood there, turned toward It, his jaw hanging slightly loose, and his vacant blue eyes slowly twirled. Oh yes, things could always be worse. These twirling eyes within Charles Wallace's soft round face made Meg icy cold inside and out. She looked away from Charles Wallace and at her father. Her father stood there with Mrs. Who's glasses still perched on his nose. Did he remember that he had them on? And he shouted to Calvin, "Don't give in." "I won't. Help, Meg," Calvin yelled back. It was absolutely silent within the dome, and yet Meg realized that the only way to speak was to shout with all the power possible, for everywhere she looked, everywhere she turned, was the rhythm, and as it continued to control the systole and diastole of her heart, the intake and outlet of her breath, the red miasma began to creep before her eyes again, and she was afraid that she was going to lose consciousness. As if she did that, she would be completely in the power of It. Mrs. Whatsit had said, "Meg, I give you your faults." What were her greatest faults? Anger, impatience, stubbornness. Yes, it was her faults that she turned to save herself now. With an immense effort, she tried to breathe against the rhythm of It, but its power was too strong. Each time she managed to take a breath out of rhythm, an iron hand seemed to squeeze her heart and lungs. Then she remembered that when they had been standing before the man with red eyes, the man with red eyes had been intoning the multiplication table at them. Charles Wallace had fought against his power by shouting out nursery rhymes, and Calvin by the Gettysburg Address. "Georgie, Porgy, pudding and pie," she yelled, "kissed the girls and made them cry." That was no good. It was too easy for nursery rhymes to fall into the rhythm of It. She didn't know the Gettysburg Address. How did the Declaration of Independence begin? She had memorized it only that winter, not because she was required to at school, but simply because she liked it. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," she shouted, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain and unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As she cried out the words, she felt a mind moving in her own, felt it squeezing her brain. Then she realized that Charles Wallace was speaking, or being spoken through by it. But that's exactly what we have on Camazotz. Complete equality. Everybody exactly alike. For a moment her brain reeled with confusion, then came a moment of blazing truth. No, she cried triumphantly. Like and equal are not the same thing at all. Good girl, Meg, her father shouted at her. But Charles Wallace continued, as though there had been no interruption. In Camazotz, all are equal. In Camazotz, everybody is the same as everybody else. But he gave her no argument, provided no answer, and she held on to her moment of revelation. Like and equal are two entirely different things. For the moment she had escaped from the power of it. But how? She knew that her own puny little brain was no match for this great bodiless, pulsing, writhing mass on the round dais. She shuddered as she looked at it. In the lab at school there was a human brain preserved in formaldehyde, and the seniors preparing for college had to take it out and look at it and study it. Meg had felt that when that day came she would never be able to endure it, but now she thought that if only she had a dissecting knife, she would slash at it, cutting ruthlessly through cerebrum and cerebellum. Words spoke within her directly this time, not through Charles. Don't you realize that if you destroy me, you also destroy your little brother? If that great brain were crushed, would every mind under its control on Camazotz die too? Charles Wallace and the man with red eyes and the man who ran the #1 spelling machine on the second grade level and all the children playing ball and skipping rope and all the mothers and all the men and women going in and out of the buildings. Was their life completely dependent on it? Were they beyond all possibility of salvation? She felt the brain reaching at her again as she let her stubborn control slip. Red fog glazed her eyes. Faintly she heard her father's voice, though she knew he was shouting at the top of his lungs. The periodic table of elements, Meg. Say it. A picture flashed into her mind of winter evenings spent sitting before the open fire and studying with her father. Hydrogen, helium. She started obediently. Keep them in their proper atomic order. What next? She knew. Yes. Lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine. She shouted the words at her father, turned away from it. Neon, sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, phosphorus. Too rhythmical, her father shouted. What's the square root of 5? For a moment she was able to concentrate. Rack your brains yourself, Meg. Don't let it rack them. The square root of 5 is 2.236, she cried triumphantly, because 2.236 times 2.236 equals 5. What's the square root of 7? The square root of 7 is, she broke off. She wasn't holding out. It was getting at her, and she couldn't concentrate, not even on math. And soon she, too, would be absorbed in it. She would be an it. Tesser, sir. She heard Calvin's voice through the red darkness. Tesser. She felt her father grab her by the wrist. There was a terrible jerk that seemed to break every bone in her body. Then the dark nothing of tessering. If tessering with Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which had been a strange and fearful experience, it was nothing like tessering with her father. After all, Mrs. Which was experienced at it, and Mr. Murray, how did he know anything about it at all? Meg felt that she was being torn apart by a whirlwind. She was lost in an agony of pain that finally dissolved into the darkness of complete unconsciousness. Chapter 10. Absolute Zero. The first sign of returning consciousness was cold, then sound. She was aware of voices that seemed to be traveling through her across an arctic waste. Slowly the icy sounds cleared, and she realized that the voices belonged to her father and Calvin. She did not hear Charles Wallace. She tried to open her eyes, but the lids would not move. She tried to sit up, but she could not stir. She struggled to turn over, to move her hands, her feet, but nothing happened. She knew that she had a body, but it was lifeless as marble. She heard Calvin's frozen voice. Her heart is beating slowly, so slowly, her father's voice. But it's beating. She's alive. Barely. We couldn't find her heartbeat at all first. We thought she was dead. Yes. And then we could feel her heart, very faintly, the beats very far apart, and then it got stronger, so all we have to do is wait. Her father's words sounded brittle in her ears, as though they were being chipped out of ice. Calvin. Yes, you're right, sir. She wanted to call out to them. I'm alive. I'm very much alive. Only I've been turned to stone. But she could not call out any more than she could move. Calvin's voice again. Anyhow, you got her away from it. You got us both away, and we couldn't have gone on holding out. It's so much more powerful and strong than. How did we stay out, sir? How did we manage as long as we did? Her father. Because it's completely unused to being refused. That's the only reason I could keep from being absorbed, too. No mind has tried to hold out against it for so many thousands of centuries that certain centers have become soft and atrophied through lack of use. If you hadn't come to me when you did, I'm not sure how much longer I would have lasted. I was on the point of giving in. Calvin. Oh, no, sir. Her father. Yes. Nothing seemed important anymore but rest, and of course it offered me complete rest. I had almost come to the conclusion that I was wrong to fight, that it was right after all. and everything I believed in most passionately was nothing but a madman's dream. But then you and Meg came into me, broke through my prison, and hope and faith returned. Calvin. Sir, why were you on Camazotz at all? Was there a particular reason for going there? Her father with a frigid laugh. Going to Camazotz was a complete accident. I never intended even to leave our own solar system. I was heading for Mars. Tessering is even more complicated than we had expected. Calvin. Sir, how was it able to get Charles Wallace before it got Meg and me? Her father. From what you've told me, it's because Charles Wallace thought he could deliberately go into it and return. He trusted too much to his own strength. Listen, I think the heartbeat is getting stronger. His words no longer sounded to her quite as frozen. Was it his words that were ice, or her ears? Why did she hear only her father and Calvin? Why didn't Charles Wallace speak? Silence, a long silence, then Calvin's voice again. Can't we do anything? Can't we look for help? Do we just have to go on waiting? Her father. We can't leave her, and we must stay together. We must not be afraid to take time. Calvin. You mean we were? We rushed into things on Camazotz too fast, and Charles Wallace rushed in too fast, and that's why he got caught? Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know enough yet. Time is different on Camazotz anyhow. Our time is inadequate, though it is. At least it's straightforward. It may not be even fully one-dimensional because it can't move back and forth on its line, only ahead. But at least it's consistent in its direction. Time on Camazotz seemed to be inverted, turned in on itself. So I have no idea whether I was imprisoned in that column for centuries or only for minutes. Silence for a moment, then her father's voice again. I think I feel a pulse in her wrist now. Meg could not feel his fingers against her wrist. She could not feel her wrist at all. Her body was still stone, but her mind was beginning to be capable of movement. She tried desperately to make some kind of sound, a signal to them, but nothing happened. Their voices started again. Calvin, about your project, sir. Were you on it alone? Her father. Oh no, there were half a dozen of us working on it, and I dare say a number of others we don't know about. Certainly we weren't the only nation to investigate along that line. It's not really a new idea, but we did try very hard not to let it be known abroad that we were trying to make it practical. Did you come to Camazotz alone, or were there others with you? I came alone. You see, Calvin, there was no way to try it out ahead with rats or monkeys or dogs. We had no idea whether it would really work or whether it would be complete bodily disintegration. Playing with time and space is a dangerous game. But why you, sir? I wasn't the first. We drew straws, and I was second. What happened to the first man? We don't... Look, did her eyelids move? Silence. Then, no, it was only a shadow. But I did blink. Meg tried to tell them. I'm sure I did, and I can hear you. Do something. But there was only another long silence, during which perhaps they were looking at her, watching for another shadow, another flicker. Then she heard her father's voice again. Quiet, a little warmer, more like his own voice. We drew straws, and I was second. We know Hank went. We saw him go. We saw him vanish right in front of the rest of us. He was there, then he wasn't. We were to wait for a year for his return, for some message. We waited. Nothing. Calvin, his voice cracking. Jeepers, sir. You must have been in sort of a flap. Her father. Yes, it's a frightening as well as an exciting thing to discover that matter and energy are the same thing, that size is an illusion, and that time is a material substance. We can know this, but it's far more than we can understand with our puny little brains. I think you'll be able to comprehend far more than I, and Charles Wallace even more than you. Yes, but what happened, please, sir, after the first man? Meg could hear her father sigh. Then it was my turn. I went, and here I am, a wiser and humbler man. I'm sure I haven't been gone 2 years. Now that you've come, I have some point that I may be able to return in time. One thing I have to tell the others is that we know nothing. Calvin, what do you mean, sir? Father, just what I say. We're children playing with dynamite. In our mad rush, we've plunged into this before. With a desperate effort, Meg made a sound. It wasn't a very loud sound, but it was a sound. Mr. Murray stopped. Hush, listen. Meg made a strange croaking noise. She found that she could pull open her eyelids. They felt heavier than marble, but she managed to raise them. Her father and Calvin were hovering over her. She did not see Charles Wallace. Where was he? She was lying in an open field of what looked like rusty, stubby grass. She blinked slowly and with difficulty. Meg, her father said. Meg, are you all right? Her tongue felt like a stone tongue in her mouth, but she managed to croak. I can't move. Try, Calvin urged. He sounded now as though he were very angry with her. Wiggle your toes, wiggle your fingers. I can't. Where's Charles Wallace? Her words were blunted by the stone tongue. Perhaps they could not understand her, for there was no answer. We were knocked out for a minute, too, Calvin was saying. You'll be all right, Meg. Don't get panicky. He was crouched over her, and though his voice continued to sound cross, he was peering at her with anxious eyes. She knew that she must still have her glasses on because she could see him clearly, his freckles, his stubby black lashes, the bright blue of his eyes. Her father was kneeling on her other side. The round lenses of Mrs. Hugh's glasses still blurred his eyes. He took one of her hands and rubbed it between his. "Can you feel my fingers?" He sounded quite calm, as though there were nothing extraordinary in having her completely paralyzed. At the quiet of his voice she felt calmer. Then she saw that there were great drops of sweat standing out on his forehead, and she noticed vaguely that the gentle breeze that touched her cheeks was cool. At first his words had been frozen. Now the wind was mild. Was it icy cold here, or warm? "Can you feel my fingers?" he asked again. Yes, now she could feel a pressure against her wrist, but she could not nod. "Where's Charles Wallace?" Her words were a little less blurred. Her tongue, her lips were beginning to feel cold and numb, as though she had been given a massive dose of Novocaine at the dentist. She realized with a start that her body and limbs were cold, and that not only was she not warm, she was frozen from head to toe, and it was this that had made her father's words seem like ice, that had paralyzed her. "I'm frozen," she said faintly. Camazotz hadn't been this cold, a cold that cut deeper than the wind on the bitterest of winter days at home. She was away from it, but this unexplained iciness was almost as bad. Her father had not saved her. Now she was able to look around a little, and everything she could see was rusty and gray. There were trees edging the field in which she lay, and their leaves were the same brown as the grass. There were plants that might have been flowers, except that they were dull and gray. In contrast to the drabness of color, to the cold that numbed her, the air was filled with delicate, spring-like fragrance, almost imperceptible, as it blew softly against her face. Imperceptible against her face. She looked at her father and Calvin. They were both in their shirt sleeves, and they looked perfectly comfortable. It was she, wrapped in her clothes, who was frozen too solid even to shiver. "Why am I so cold?" she asked. "Where's Charles Wallace?" They did not answer. "Father, where are we?" Mr. Murray looked at her soberly. "I don't know, Meg. I don't test her very well. I must have overshot somehow. We're not on Camazotz." "I don't know where we are. I think you're so cold because we went through the black thing. I thought for a moment I was going to tear you away from me." "Is this a dark planet?" Slowly her tongue was beginning to thaw. Her words were less blurred. "I don't think so," Mr. Murray said, "but I know so little about anything that I can't be sure. You shouldn't have tried to test her then." She had never spoken to her father in this way before. The words seemed hardly to be hers. Calvin looked at her, shaking his head. "It was the only thing to do. At least it got us off Camazotz. Why did we go without Charles Wallace? Did we just leave him there?" The words that were not really hers came out cold and accusing. "We didn't just leave him," her father said. "Remember that the human brain is a very delicate organism, and it can be easily damaged. See, Meg?" Calvin crossed over her, tense and worried. "If your father had tried to yank Charles away when he tested us, and if it had kept grabbing hold of Charles, it might have been too much for him, and we'd have lost him forever, and we had to do something right then. Why, it was taking us. You and I were slipping, and if your father had gone on trying to help us, he wouldn't have been able to hold out much longer either." "You told him to test her," Meg charged Calvin. "There isn't any question of blame," Mr. Murray cut in severely. "Can you move yet?" All Meg's faults were uppermost in her now, and they were no longer helping her. "No, and you'd better take me back to Camazotz and Charles Wallace quickly. You're supposed to be able to help." Disappointment was as dark and corrosive in her as the black thing. The ugly words tumbled from her cold lips, even as she herself could not believe that it was to her father, her beloved, longed-for father, that she was talking to in this way. If her tears had not still been frozen, they would have gushed from her eyes. She had found her father, and he had not made everything all right. Everything kept getting worse and worse. The long search for her father was ended, and he wasn't able to overcome all their difficulties. There was nothing to guarantee that it would all come out right in the end. There was nothing left to hope for. She was frozen, and Charles Wallace was being devoured by it, and her omnipotent father was doing nothing. She teetered on the seesaw of love and hate, and the black thing pushed her down into hate. "You don't even know where we are," she cried out at her father. "We'll never see Mother or the twins again. We don't know where Earth is, or even where Camazotz is. We're lost out in space. What are you going to do?" She did not realize that she was as much in power of the black thing as Charles Wallace. Mr. Murray bent over her, massaging her cold fingers. She could not see his face. "My daughter, I am not a Mrs. Whatsit, a Mrs. Who, or a Mrs. Which. Yes, Calvin has told me everything he could. I'm a human being and a very fallible one. But I agree with Calvin. We were sent here for something, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose." "The black thing," Meg cried out at him. "Why did you let it almost get me?" "You've never tested as well as the rest of us," Calvin reminded her. "It never bothered Charles and me as much as it did you." "He shouldn't have taken me then," Meg said, "until he learned to do it better." Neither her father nor Calvin spoke. Her father continued his gentle massage. Her fingers came back to life with tingling pain. "You're hurting me." Then you're feeling again, her father said quietly. I'm afraid it's going to hurt, Meg. The piercing pain moved slowly up her arms, began in her toes and legs. She started to cry out against her father when Calvin exclaimed, Look! Coming toward them, moving in silence across the brown grass, were three figures. What were they? On Uriel, there had been the magnificent creatures. On Camazotz, the inhabitants had at least resembled people. What were these three strange things approaching? They were the same dull gray color as the flowers. If they hadn't walked upright, they would have seemed like animals. They moved directly toward the three human beings. They had 4 arms, and far more than 5 fingers to each hand, and the fingers were not fingers, but long waving tentacles. They had heads, and they had faces, but where the faces of the creatures on Uriel had seemed far more than human faces, these seemed far less. Where the features would normally be, there were several indentations, and in place of ears and hair were more tentacles. They were tall. Meg realized as they came closer, far taller than any man. They had no eyes, just soft indentations. Meg's rigid, frozen body tried to shudder with terror, but instead of shudder, all that came was pain. She moaned. The things stood over them. They appeared to be looking down at them, except they had no eyes with which to see. Mr. Murray continued to kneel by Meg, massaging her. He's killed us, bringing us here, Meg thought. I'll never see Charles Wallace again, or Mother, or the twins. Calvin rose to his feet. He bowed to the beast as though they could see him. He said, How do you do, sir, ma'am? Who are you? The tallest of the beasts said. His voice was neither hostile nor welcoming, and it came from the mouth like indentation in the furry face, but from the waving tentacles. They'll eat us, Meg thought wildly. They're making me hurt. My toes, my fingers. I hurt. Calvin answered the beast's questions. We are from Earth. I'm not sure how we got here. We've had an accident. Meg, this girl, is paralyzed. She can't move. She's terribly cold. We think that's why she can't move. One of them came up to Meg and squatted down on its huge haunches beside her, and she felt utter loathing and revulsion as it reached out a tentacle to touch her face. But with the tentacle came the same delicate fragrance that moved across her with the breeze, and she felt a soft tingling warmth go all through her that momentarily assuaged her pain. She felt suddenly sleepy. I must look as strange to it as it looks to me, she thought drowsily, and then realized with a shock that, of course, the beast couldn't see her at all. Nevertheless, a reassuring sense of safety flowed through her, with a warmth which continued to seep deep into her as the beast touched her. Then it picked her up, cradling her in 2 of its 4 arms. Mr. Murray stood up quickly. What are you doing? Taking the child. Chapter 11. Aunt Beast. No, Mr. Murray said sharply. Please put her down. A sense of amusement seemed to emanate from the beast. The tallest, who seemed to be the spokesman, said, We frighten you? What are you going to do with us? Mr. Murray asked. The beast said, I'm sorry. We communicate better with the other one. He turned toward Calvin. Who are you? I'm Calvin O'Keefe. What's that? I'm a boy, a young man. You, too, are afraid? I'm not sure. Tell me, the beast said. What do you suppose you'd do if 3 of us suddenly arrived on your home planet? Shoot you, I guess? Calvin admitted. Then isn't that what we should do with you? Calvin's freckles seemed to deepen, but he answered quietly, I'd rather you didn't. I mean, the Earth's my home, and I'd rather be there anywhere in the world, the universe, and I can't wait to get back, but we make some awful bloopers there. The smallest beast, the one holding Meg, said, and perhaps they aren't used to visitors from other planets. Used to it, Calvin explained. We've never had any as far as I know. Why? I don't know. The middle beast, a tremor of trepidation in his words, said, You aren't from a dark planet, are you? No, Calvin shook his head firmly, though the beast couldn't see him. We're shadowed, or we're fighting the shadow. The beast holding Meg questioned, You 3 are fighting? Yes, Calvin answered. Now that we know about it. The tall one turned back to Mr. Murray, speaking sternly. You, the oldest, man, from where have you come? Now, Mr. Murray answered steadily, From a planet called Camazotz. There was a mutter from the 3 beasts. We do not belong there, Mr. Murray said slowly and distinctly. We are strangers there as we are here. I was a prisoner there, and these children rescued me. My youngest son, my baby, is still there, trapped in the dark mind of it. Meg tried to twist around in the beast's arms to glare at her father and Calvin. Why were they being so frank? Weren't they aware of the danger? But again her anger was dissolved as the gentle warmth from the tentacles flowed through her. She realized that she could move her fingers and toes with comparative freedom, and the pain was no longer so acute. We must take this child back with us, the beast holding her head. Meg shouted at her father, Don't leave me the way you left Charles. With this burst of terror, a spasm of pain racked her body, and she gasped. Stop fighting, the beast told her. You make it worse. Relax. That's what it said, Meg cried. Father, Calvin, help. The beast turned toward Calvin and Mr. Murray. This child is in danger. You must trust us. We have no alternative, Mr. Murray said. Can you save her? I think so. May I stay with her? No, but you will not be far away. We feel that you are hungry, tired, and that you would like to bathe and rest. And this little, what is the word? The beast cocked its tentacles at Calvin. Girl, Calvin said. This little girl needs prompt and special care. The coldest of the, what is it you call it? The black thing. The black thing, yes. The black thing burns unless it is counteracted properly. 3 bees stood around Meg, and it seemed that they were feeling into her with their softly waving tentacles. The movement of the tentacles was as rhythmic and flowing as the dance of an undersea plant, and lying there, cradled in 4 strange arms, Meg, despite herself, felt a sense of security that was deeper than anything she had known since the days when she lay in her mother's arms in the old rocking chair and was sung to sleep. With her father's help, she had been able to resist it. Now she could hold out no longer. She leaned her head against the beast's chest and realized that the gray body was covered with the softest, most delicate fur imaginable, and the fur had the same beautiful odor as the air. I hope I don't smell awful to it, she thought. But then she knew with a deep sense of comfort that even if she did smell awful, the beast would forgive her. As the tall figure cradled her, she could feel the frigid stiffness of her body relaxing against it. This bliss could not come to her from a thing like it. It could only give pain, never relieve it. The beast must be good. They had to be good. She sighed deeply, like a very small child, and suddenly she was asleep. When she came to herself again, there was in the back of her mind a memory of pain, of agonizing pain. But the pain was over now, and her body was lapped in comfort. She was lying on something wonderfully soft in an enclosed chamber. It was dark. All she could see were occasional tall moving shadows, which she realized were bees walking about. She had been stripped of her clothes, and something warm and pungent was gently being rubbed into her body. She sighed and stretched and discovered that she could stretch. She could move again. She was no longer paralyzed, and her body was bathed in waves of warmth. Her father had not saved her. The beasts had. So you are awake, little one. The words came gently to her ears. What a funny little tadpole you are. Is the pain gone now? All gone. Are you warm and alive again? Yes, I'm fine. She struggled to sit up. No, lie still, small one. You must not exert yourself as yet. We will have a fur garment for you in a moment, and then we will feed you. You must not even try to feed yourself. You must be as an infant again. The black thing does not relinquish its victims willingly. Where are Father and Calvin? Have they gone back for Charles Wallace? They are eating and resting, the beast said, and we are trying to learn about each other and see what is best to help you. We feel now that you are not dangerous, and that we will be allowed to help you. Why is it so dark in here? Meg asked. She tried to look around, but all she could see was shadows. Nevertheless, there was a sense of openness, a feel of gentle breeze moving lightly about that kept the darkness from being oppressive. Perplexity came to her from the beast. What is this dark? What is this light? We do not understand. Your father and the boy Calvin have asked this too. They say that it is night now on our planet, and that they cannot see. They have told us that our atmosphere is what they call opaque, so that the stars are not visible, and then they were surprised that we know stars, that we know their music and the movements of their dance far better than beings like you who spend hours studying them through what you call telescopes. We do not understand what this means, to see. Well, it's what things look like, Meg said helplessly. We do not know what things look like, as you say, the beast said. We know what things are like. It must be a very limiting thing, this scene. Oh no, Meg cried. It's the most wonderful thing in the world. What a very strange world yours must be, the beast said, that of such a peculiar-seeming thing should be one of the most importance. Of such importance. Try to tell me, what is this thing called light that you are able to do so little without? Well, we can't see without it, Meg said, realizing that she was completely unable to explain vision in light and dark. How can you explain the sight on a world where no one has ever seen and where there is no need of eyes? Well, on this planet, she fumbled, you have a sun, don't you? The most wonderful sun comes from which comes our warmth, and the rays which give us our flowers, and our food, our music, and all things which make life and growth. Well, Meg said, when we are turned toward the sun, our earth, our planet, toward our sun, we receive its light, and when we are turned away from it, it is night. If we want to see, we have to use artificial lights. Artificial lights, the beast sighed. How very complicated life on your planet must be. Later on, you must try to explain some more to me. All right, Meg promised, and yet she knew that to try to explain anything that could be seen with the eyes would be impossible, because the beast in some way saw, knew, understood far more completely than she of her parents or Calvin, or even Charles Wallace. Charles Wallace, she cried. What are they going to do? What are they doing about Charles Wallace? We don't know what it's doing to him or making him do. Please, oh, please help us. Yes, little one, of course we will help you. A meeting is in session right now to study what is best to do. We have never before been able to talk to anyone who has managed to escape from a dark planet. So although your father is blaming himself for everything that has happened, we feel that he must be quite an extraordinary person to get out of Camazotz with you at all. But the little boy, and I understand that he is a very special, a very important little boy. Ah, my child, you must accept that this will not be easy, to go back through the black thing, go back to Camazotz. I do not know. I don't know. But Father left him, Meg said. He's not going to bring him back, or he's got to bring him back. He can't just abandon Charles Wallace.